So they had the idea of trying to see what the original exemplars were of architecture. After all, being steeped in Vitruvius, they knew that Greek architecture was considered such an important antecedent for Roman architecture that it would be worth exploring. So they set off, and first they had the good fortune of being associated with the Society of the Dilettanti, and they did this through one of their acquaintances in Rome who suggested that they look to the Society of Dilettanti for patronage. And now this group started out as a drinking club in 1732, and in fact Horace Walpole is said to have remarked that it was a club for which the nominal qualification is having been in Italy and the real one being drunk. So at least in the 1730s, this was the reputation that the Society of the Dilettanti had. And of course you can see here the glasses being raised and so on. But actually over time, the scholarly aspect and the scientific aspect was one that became more predominant. And in fact, it still exists today, although it's somewhat secret. And they even give donations to the British School in Athens and the British School in Rome. So the Society of Dilettanti still is an ongoing organization. Now in this group portrait, of which many were made over time, we see Sir William Hamilton, who is the British envoy to Naples. And you see him there with a Greek vase, as they were called then, and a book showing the publication of it. And all of this was right about the time in the 1760s, during which people were eagerly waiting for the publication of Stuart and Rivette's book as well. So what we see with this group is men who had a kind of a jolly social attitude to what they were doing. They had all kinds of institutions about initiation that seems to have been borrowed from the Masons. And they all were deeply, deeply read in Latin and Greek. And in particularly, they loved Horace, and they had many, many different quotations from Horace that one can read in the minutes of the society, which actually, some of which have been published. So this society played an important role in financing Stuart and Rivette's expedition. Now, what I'm going to show you next is what some of the earlier people drew in Athens, just so that you can make a comparison with what Stuart and Rivette did and see why what they did was so important. The earliest drawing that we have is actually by Cyriac of Ancona, probably done about 1444, and his notebooks were burnt in a fire in the early 16th century, but fortunately his friends had copied things out, so don't blame him entirely for the horribleness of this drawing of the Parthenon. It's not entirely his fault. But you see that he at least got the idea that it was an octa-style facade here with 8 columns across. And he seems to have noticed the horses, presumably of Poseidon or Athena, and some draped female figure lurching across the pediment here. And you can see that he had a rough idea about what the steps might have looked like. But again, we can't necessarily blame him for this drawing because it is, after all, a copy of it. Now, based on this drawing then, Giuliano da San Gallo, just a little bit later, around 1500, drew up his own copy. And notice how he felt totally free to change the order from Doric to a weird composite with Ionic and Corinthian down here, and to add a couple of extra tall columns. And how about these metopes stuck up behind here? Now this looks like something that you might find in Rome, actually. But here Giuliano da San Gallo is supposedly making a copy of Cyriac of Ancona. So you can see why people wanted a little bit more authenticity. Moving onward then, Jacob Spon in 1676 made this effort, again with a very unclear understanding of what a pediment would look like, a little gap here in between the columns on the facade. And he actually thought that the west side of the Parthenon was the entrance, and he thought that the sculpture that he was seeing there actually represented the birth of Athena. And he also thought that it was Hadrianic, all of which set into place some negative ideas about the sculpture of the Parthenon that would be brought up much later when the British Parliament was debating whether to whether to purchase Lord Elgin's marbles. So this drawing actually had a long history to it of rather baleful effects. Then, a little bit more accurate here is Richard Pocock's drawing of 1741. So now this is the sort of thing that presumably James Stewart and Nicholas and Rivette could actually have seen for themselves. So the Doric columns are shown accurately. There are 8 here, but again, he didn't know quite what to do with the pediment. And notice the little plants growing out here, and the sky looking a little bit cloudy up here. So there's still a little bit of a romantic angle there, but at least he made an attempt, and also he tried to give some sections of the frieze. So I'm showing you this so that you can see that Stewart and Rivette were not alone in wanting accuracy. It's just that Richard Pocock, for whatever reason, just wasn't able to make it. I also want to remind you of the drawings of the sculpture by Jacques Carré, which I'm sure some of you at least have studied, that were made in 1674, before the Venetians bombarded the Parthenon in 1687. So they're very, very important documents, particularly for the frieze where they fill in some pieces that no longer exist. So I show you this just so that you can see people did know how to draw. It wasn't a case of not knowing how to draw. It was a case of being able to make an accurate representation and being able to take accurate measurements. Now, those were the predecessors of Stewart and Rivette. Now I want to show you their contemporaries and their main rival, Leroy. Piranesi was their major contemporary, who probably in part might have been responsible for inspiring the idea. I've just chosen one view here of the Forum that shows you the Arch of Septimius Severus here, and notice that we see people there at a small scale, and you have the sense of a desolate open space, and it's meant to convey a sense of the passage of time, of history that turns itself over. The wheel goes again and again, and monuments rise and fall, and it has almost a whole ideology attached to it, to what it's meant to convey. But certainly it's filled in with scenes of everyday life here, and yet the individual components are reasonably accurately depicted. It's just that the picture as a whole is meant to present to you Rome as it looks today in a historical framework. So it's not seeking to recapture antiquity. It's not singling out one particular period and saying this is the one we want to study. Rather, it's meant to be conveyed to you in an artistic way what Rome looked like in his day. Now, toward the very end of his life, the temples at Paestum, just south of Naples, became available. They were, in a sense, rediscovered, and some drawings had been published of them. And there began to be a major controversy among the circle of people in Rome about which was better, Greek or Roman architecture. And Piranesi was adamantly on the side of the people who argued for the superiority of Roman architecture, but nonetheless, in his declining years, he went to Paestum. He saw this early archaic temple we now know of Hera II at Paestum, and he made this drawing, which was published by him in the last year of his life, 1778. So notice the water buffalo here, looking rather hungry, with their ribs showing, the cow herd on this side, the plants also up in the architrave here of the temple, residual modern buildings on the site, and so on. Now, these views nonetheless became very popular, and I think it's quite interesting that despite his firm stance that Roman architecture was superior, nonetheless he contributed to the appreciation of Greek architecture by recording Paestum so well. So Stewart and Rivette knew about this. It hadn't yet been published, but they knew of earlier views of Piranesi, like the one in the Roman Forum that I just showed you.